In August of 2019, the people who lived in 5 apartment buildings in Tampa, Florida were called into a meeting. They were told that archaeologists had run radar through their yards. They were told what the radar found. In the room, people started crying. Some made the sign of the cross. A few had to get up and walk out. The vice president of the tenant council said it as plainly as it can be said. Those people are still there. Underneath the buildings where those families had been raising children, doing laundry, and parking their cars, there is a cemetery. Not a former cemetery, not a relocated one. A cemetery with the coffins still in it, 4 to 6 feet down, laid out in rows running east to west, exactly the way somebody arranged them more than a century ago. It has a name: Zion. It was the first burial ground in Tampa for Black people, opened in 1901, and there are death certificates on file for 763 human beings who were buried in it. For most of a century, the city's position was that Zion had been moved. Then radar went through the ground, and what came back stopped everyone involved. We will come back to what the radar found, and to the second thing, the small objects the archaeologists began pulling out of the dirt once they were finally allowed to dig, which told them something the radar never could. But to understand why this one hurt the way it did, you first have to know who built Zion, and what the city did in 1951 when it already knew. And that is exactly why this channel exists. This is one of those stories somebody decided you were never supposed to hear. If you want the history that got paved over on purpose, subscribe now and stay with me. What is under this particular apartment complex is going to stay with you for a long time. Go to Tampa today. Head to the 3700 block of North Florida Avenue, north of downtown. You will find a low public housing complex, a towing yard, and some warehouse property. Traffic on Florida Avenue, chain link, parking, tow trucks backing in. The kind of block you have driven through in every American city without registering that you were there. There is no gate, no iron fence, no rows of stone. Nothing about it says cemetery because everything that said cemetery was taken away on purpose. 2.5 acres of that block is a graveyard. Now go back to 1901. Tampa was a Jim Crow city, and Jim Crow followed people into the ground. Black Tampans could not be buried where white Tampans were buried. There was almost nowhere to put your dead. A black businessman named Richard Doby bought 2.5 acres north of the city and opened a cemetery. Think about what a man in his position was doing. In 1901, in Florida, in a state that would go on to lead much of the South in lynchings per capita, he put his own money into ground so that black families would have somewhere dignified to bury their mothers. And look at what he named it: Zion, the city on the hill, the promised place. He was not naming a plot of dirt. He was making a statement about where the people going into it deserved to end up. Zion took burials for about 22 years. It closed around 1923. In those 22 years, it filled up with ordinary people, dock workers, cigar rollers from the factories in Ybor City, domestic workers, their children, and there were a lot of children, because black infant mortality in a Jim Crow city was what it was. Families walked out to that ground on Sundays. And then it went away. Not the bodies, the cemetery. By the late 1920s, the land north of Tampa was getting valuable, and Zion sat in the path of white development. The property was divided and sold. And before the building started, somebody went through and took the headstones off the graves. Read that again. The markers were removed. The people underneath them were not. A cemetery without headstones looks like a vacant lot. That is the entire trick. You do not have to move 763 bodies if you can just move the stones and let everyone assume. And the assumption held. The official story, repeated for decades, was that Zion's graves had been relocated in the mid-1920s. Now here is the part of this story that should make you put your coffee down. In about 1949, the Tampa Housing Authority began assembling land for a new public housing development. Roughly 1.5 acres of what it acquired was Zion Cemetery. Construction on Robles Park Village started, and in 1951, a crew digging near what is now Moore Avenue hit something. 3 caskets, 15 inches below the surface, with human remains in them. This was not hidden, it was in the newspapers at the time. City officials told the Housing Authority that these must be strays, the last few left behind when Zion was moved in the 20s, and that there was nothing more down there. Nobody checked. The housing authority's own minutes from that period record no effort to search the rest of the site. Construction continued. Understand how small a thing would have been required here. Somebody digs another 20 feet in any direction. Somebody pulls the 1901 plat map. Somebody asks a single black family in the neighborhood where Zion used to be, because those families knew. None of it happened, and it did not have to be a conspiracy for it not to happen. It only had to be a group of men who did not consider it worth the delay. And there is one more detail. Robles Park Village, built directly on top of Tampa's first black cemetery, was originally a whites-only housing project. Sit with that. 15 inches, 3 coffins, and the answer was to keep pouring concrete. From 1951 until 2019, families lived on that ground. 68 years of birthdays and funerals and school mornings, on top of people whose graves nobody had ever moved. Now let me tell you about a woman named Univa Massey. She grew up next to Zion. As an old woman, 97 years old, she was still able to describe what she had seen there as a girl in 1933. She remembered bodies being taken out of the ground. She remembered it being done carelessly, in a hurry, and she remembered that bones were left behind. Hold both of those pictures at once. A child in 1933 watching an exhumation done so badly that pieces of people stayed in the dirt. And a city, 18 years later, telling a housing authority that everyone had been properly relocated. She was still alive to say it out loud when the archaeologists arrived. That is how recent this is. So how did anyone finally find Zion? It did not start with a machine. It started with a man reading death certificates. Ray Reed was a cemetery researcher going through old Hillsborough County records, and he kept running into the same phrase, Zion Cemetery, over and over, in the burial field, on certificate after certificate. The problem was that Zion Cemetery did not exist. Not on any modern map, not on any county list, not anywhere. Hundreds of people had been officially, legally buried in a place that the record said was not real. Reed took it to Paul Guzzo, a reporter at the Tampa Bay Times. Guzzo and his colleague James Borchuk spent months on it, and in June of 2019, the Times published what they had found. More than 800 people had been buried along North Florida Avenue, and nobody could say where those people were now. The housing authority hired archaeologists. And this is where the technology comes in. Ground-penetrating radar works on a simple principle. A machine is pushed slowly across the surface, the way you would mow a lawn. It fires pulses of energy into the earth and listens for the echo. Undisturbed soil answers one way. A shaft that was dug and refilled answers another. A void, a coffin, a collapsed wooden box. Each returns its own signature. They ran it across the lawns and the sidewalks and the parking areas at Robles Park Village, right up against people's porches. Children were outside while they worked, and the ground answered. The report came back on the 30th of August, 2019. More than 126 anomalies, rectangular, the size and shape of coffins, between 4 and 6 feet down, and they were in rows, oriented east to west. That is the detail that ends the argument. Random buried objects do not line up. Construction debris does not orient itself into parallel ranks pointing the same direction. And east to west is not an accident either. It is a burial convention, the head placed so the body faces the sunrise. What the radar was looking at was a cemetery that had never been touched, still holding the arrangement that mourners gave it in 1910 under a parking lot. Then they scanned the neighbors. 55 more graves under the towing yard. More than 115 under the warehouse property next door. The count climbed past 300. And here is where I have to be careful with you, but not in the direction you are expecting. Usually at this point I tell you that radar overstates things. Here the opposite is true. That number is a floor, not a ceiling. The radar was only run over about a third of the site because it cannot see through the concrete slabs of 5 apartment buildings. And it cannot detect a burial with no coffin, which in Tampa in the early 1900s was how many poor black families had to bury their dead. Death certificates account for 763 people. Archaeologists estimate the real number interred at Zion may approach 1,000. The radar found around 300. The other several hundred are not missing. They are under the buildings. In 2020, after the residents had been relocated, the archaeologists were finally allowed to open the ground and check. It is called ground truthing, and it is done a few millimeters at a time so that nothing is disturbed. The grave stains match the radar. Under the sidewalks they demolished, the shapes were exactly where the scans said they would be, and the stains kept going, past the edge of what they could reach, underneath the buildings. And in that soil they started finding objects. Seashells, pieces of decorative glass, fragments of a vase, small things, the kind of objects that would mean nothing at all if you found them anywhere else. Those are not construction debris. In African American burial tradition, shells and personal objects were placed on graves on purpose, by hand, by somebody who loved the person underneath. A favorite piece of glassware off a shelf at home, carried out to a cemetery and set down. Think about what that means about the moment those graves were made. Somebody stood on that ground in 1912 and put a shell down for their mother. And then the headstones came off, and a housing project went up, and for 68 years cars parked over the top of it. The shell stayed exactly where it was put. So what does this tell us? It tells us that erasing a cemetery does not require moving anybody. It requires removing the markers and waiting. Take off the stones, sell the land, tell the next set of officials it was handled, and let each generation pass the lie forward as a fact it inherited rather than a lie it told. By 1951, the men who ordered the headstones removed were mostly gone. The city officials who said the graves had been moved were probably not lying on purpose. They were repeating what they had been given. That is what makes this pattern so durable. It only needs one deliberate act. Everything after that is just paperwork and forgetting. You have seen this shape on this channel before. Seneca Village in Manhattan, called a shanty town so a city could pave it over. The Clotilda burned and sunk in an Alabama river so there would be no evidence. Different states, different decades, same instruction. Take it, then insist there was never anything there. But Tampa did something the others did not. Once Zion was confirmed, people went looking for the rest. Researchers and reporters started pulling on every loose thread in the county, and they kept finding them. Another erased burial ground under a high school campus, with hundreds of pauper burials on the south end of the property, others under parking lots and developments across the Tampa Bay area. Zion was not the anomaly. Zion was the one they happened to check. That is the sentence I would ask you to carry out of this video. Not that a cemetery was found in Tampa. That the only reason it was found is that one researcher noticed a name on a death certificate that should not have been there. The residents of Robles Park Village were relocated. In 2025, the city put up a permanent marker on the site, cast in iron, that says plainly that the gravestones were removed when the land was sold and that hundreds of coffins are still down there. Demolition of the complex began, with the cemetery footprint left untouched and archaeologists supervising every shovel. Richard Doby bought that ground so black families in Tampa would have somewhere their dead could rest with a name on a stone. The stones came off within 30 years. It took another 90 to get one back. Well, now you know what is under that block. If this is the kind of history that was kept from you, the kind somebody went to the trouble of paving over, subscribe. This channel goes and digs it up. And tell me in the comments, whose story should we uncover next?